King Edward the Elder. Complete. Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the life of King Edward the Elder, the forgotten architect of England itself. While his father Alfred the Great burned cakes in legend, and his son Æthelstan became the first to rule all England, Edward remains lost between their shadows, despite building the very foundation upon which England stands. Before you drift into peaceful slumber, I'd love for you to share your thoughts in the comments, even just a word or two about what part of Edward's story touches you. Don't be shy. This is a warm and welcoming space. And if you enjoy these soothing historical tales, a like and subscribe helps us continue bringing you these gentle journeys through time. So settle in, close your eyes, and let the soft whispers of Anglo-Saxon England carry you toward restful sleep. Welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Edward, later known as King Edward the Elder, entered a world consumed by fire and fear. The year was somewhere between 874 and 877, the precise date lost to time, as so many details of those desperate years were lost. England, as we know it today, did not exist. Instead, a patchwork of kingdoms spread across the island, each with its own traditions, its own rulers, its own dreams, and all of them faced the same nightmare that arrived on longships from across the cold northern seas. The Vikings had come, not as raiders anymore, though they had done that for generations. No, by the time Edward drew his first breath, the Vikings had transformed from raiders into conquerors. The great heathen army, they called it, a force so vast and so terrible that it had already swallowed whole kingdoms. East Anglia had fallen, its king murdered in ways so brutal that Christian chroniclers could barely bring themselves to record the details. Northumbria, once mighty, had been carved apart. Mercia, the great kingdom of the Midlands, had been split in two like a log beneath an axe. Only Wessex remained, and Wessex stood because of Edward's father. Alfred was not yet called the Great when his second son was born. He was simply Alfred, King of the West Saxons, a man who had spent his entire reign fighting an enemy that seemed impossible to defeat. Just a few years before Edward's birth, Alfred had hidden in the marshes of Somerset, a fugitive king in his own land, watching smoke rise from burning villages and wondering if Saxon England would survive another year. But Alfred had survived. More than that, he had triumphed. The Battle of Æthelstan, fought when Edward was still too young to remember, or perhaps not yet born, had turned the tide. The Vikings agreed to peace, retreating to the east and north, establishing what would become known as the Danelaw, that portion of England where Danish law and Danish customs would hold sway. Peace, though, is a fragile thing when built between ancient enemies. Edward's mother was Æthelwold, a woman of Mercian royal blood. Her family had ruled in the lands north and west of Wessex, and her marriage to Alfred had been strategic, binding together the two most powerful remaining Saxon kingdoms. Yet Æthelwold was more than a political pawn. Contemporary sources speak of her with respect, noting her wisdom and her piety, though they tell us frustratingly little about her personality, her thoughts, her dreams for the children she bore. Edward was not the firstborn. That honour belonged to his sister, Æthelflæd, born around 869 or 870. She would become one of the most remarkable women in English history. But that story lay years ahead. Edward was the eldest son, though, and in the world of Saxon kingship, that distinction mattered enormously, or at least it should have. The truth was more complicated. Edward had uncles, Æthelhelm and Æthelwold, sons of Alfred's older brother Æthelred, who had ruled Wessex before Alfred. By the customs of the Saxons, they had claims to the throne too. Their father had been king first after all. They were older, In a society where age and lineage mattered, their claims carried weight that a child like Edward could not yet match. But Alfred, perhaps learning from the chaos that succession disputes had caused in other kingdoms, did everything in his power to ensure his own son would follow him. He kept Edward close, training him personally, having him witness royal charters, making sure that everyone who mattered saw the young prince and understood. This boy would be king. Edward's childhood was spent in his father's court, wherever that court happened to be. Saxon kings did not have fixed capitals in the way later monarchs would. They moved from estate to estate, from fortified town to fortified town, bringing their household with them. Winchester was special to Alfred, becoming something like a capital, but it was not yet the sole seat of power. What we know of Edward's education comes primarily from a man named Asser, a Welsh monk whom Alfred had invited to his court. Asser wrote a biography of Alfred, the only such contemporary biography of an Anglo-Saxon king that survives, and in it he tells us remarkable things about how Alfred raised his children. Edward and his younger sister Æthelflæd received the same education. This was extraordinary. In Saxon England, princes and princesses were typically raised separately, prepared for different roles. But Alfred, who valued learning above almost everything, insisted that both his younger children be taught together. Male and female tutors instructed them. They learned to read both ecclesiastical and secular works in English, a revolutionary choice since most education at the time focused on Latin. They studied the Psalms, committing long passages to memory. They read Old English poetry, absorbing the warrior culture and moral lessons contained in ancient verses. But Alfred didn't just want his children to read. He wanted them to embody certain virtues. Asser tells us that Edward and Æthelflæd were taught humility and gentleness, taught to be courteous to visitors and obedient to their parents. The court, Asser noted with approval, shaped them into young people worthy of their royal station. Yet Edward's education went beyond books and courtly manners. He was being prepared for war. Alfred had reorganized Wessex's military in revolutionary ways. He established a network of fortified towns called burhs, each positioned strategically to defend against Viking raids. He reformed the army, creating a system where men served in rotation, ensuring that there was always a force ready to fight while others worked their farms. He even built ships, attempting to challenge the Vikings on the seas where they had always held advantage. Edward would have grown up surrounded by soldiers, by talk of strategy, by the reality that war was not some distant concept, but an ever-present fact of life. And as he grew older, he began to participate in that war directly. The first time Edward's name appears in a military context, he is around 19 years old. The year is 893, and the Vikings have broken the peace. New armies have arrived from the continent, led by warlords who had ravaged France and now turned their attention to richer pickings in England. Alfred, now in his 40s and suffering from chronic illness, still leads his forces, but increasingly he relies on his son. At the Battle of Farnham, fought in the early summer of 893, Edward commanded a division of the West Saxon army. The Vikings had raided deep into Wessex, and Edward pursued them with a force of warriors. The details of the battle are frustratingly sparse. Saxon chroniclers tended to summarize rather than describe. But we know that Edward drove the Vikings from the field, pursuing them north until they took refuge on an island called Thorney in Mercian territory. This was Edward's proving ground. He had led men in battle. He had won. And everyone who witnessed it understood that Alfred's son was not just a prince in training, but a warrior in his own right, capable of defending the kingdom he would one day inherit. Around this same time, Edward married for the first time. His bride's name was Ecgwin, And she is one of the great mysteries of early English history. We know almost nothing about her. Later sources suggest she may have been of relatively low birth, perhaps not considered high-ranking enough to be a queen in the formal sense. Some chroniclers called her a concubine rather than a wife, though this may have been later propaganda designed to cast doubt on the legitimacy of their son. And their son mattered enormously, because their son was Æthelstan. Born around 894, Æthelstan would grow up to become the first true king of England, the man who would finally unite all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms under one crown. But in 894, he was just an infant, and no one could have guessed the role he would play in history. Edward's relationship with Egwin apparently ended around the time Alfred died. Whether through her death or through some form of separation, we cannot know. What we do know is that soon after becoming king, Edward married again, this time to a woman named Æthelflæd, daughter of an ealdorman named Æthelhelm, probably from Wiltshire. This marriage produced many children, and Æthelflæd was recognized as queen in a way that Egwin never had been. But these events lay just ahead. In the early 890s, Edward was still his father's son, still learning, still proving himself, still preparing for the enormous responsibility that awaited him. Alfred had been building something unprecedented, not just a kingdom, but an idea. He styled himself King of the Anglo-Saxons, a title that claimed authority not just over Wessex, but over all the Saxon people who remained free from Viking rule. He had forged an alliance with Mercia, sealed by the marriage of his eldest daughter Æthelflæd to Æthelred, the ealdorman who ruled the western, still Saxon portion of Mercia. He had begun to speak and write of a unified English people, bound by language and law and Christian faith, standing together against the pagan Vikings. This was the inheritance Alfred prepared for Edward, not just a kingdom, but a mission. As the 890s wore on, Alfred's health deteriorated. The exact nature of his illness remains unknown. Contemporary sources speak vaguely of a painful affliction that tormented him for most of his adult life. But as he weakened, he grew more determined to secure his son's succession. He promoted men loyal to Edward. He made sure Edward witnessed more and more royal charters, his name appearing beside Alfred's, making clear the continuity of power. He possibly even gave Edward a sub-kingdom to rule, perhaps Kent, giving the prince experience in governance before he inherited the whole realm. And Alfred did something else, something that would cause confusion and controversy later. At some point, near the end of his life, Alfred held a ceremony for his grandson Æthelstan. The boy, still very young, was invested with a scarlet cloak, a jewelled belt, and a Saxon sword in a golden scabbard. Many historians interpret this as Alfred designating Æthelstan as an eventual successor, perhaps intending to bypass Edward's later sons by other wives and ensure that his beloved grandson would one day rule. Whether Alfred intended this as a designation of Æthelstan as Edward's heir, or whether he had some more complex succession plan in mind, we cannot know for certain. What we do know is that this ceremony created complications that would haunt the family for decades, but those complications were still in the future. For now, Edward was approaching 30, battle-tested, educated, prepared. His father had shaped him into exactly the king Wessex needed, a warrior who could fight, yes, but also an administrator who understood the systems Alfred had built, who could continue the work of fortification and organization and expansion. On October 26, 899, Alfred the Great died. He was buried at Winchester in the Old Minster, the ancient church that had stood for centuries. The kingdom mourned him. Already, people were beginning to call him great, recognizing that he had achieved what had seemed impossible. He had stopped the Vikings, saved Wessex, kept the light of Saxon civilization burning when it seemed destined to be extinguished. And now it was Edward's turn. The young man who had been born into fire, who had grown up hearing stories of his father's desperate struggles, who had trained for this moment his entire life, became king. He took his father's title, King of the Anglo-Saxons. But taking a title and securing a throne are two very different things. Edward would learn that lesson quickly, and he would learn it in blood. The throne of Wessex should have been Edward's by right, but in the autumn of 899, right mattered less than power, and power could be taken by anyone bold enough, or desperate enough, to seize it. Edward's cousin Æthelwold had been waiting for this moment. We know frustratingly little about Æthelwold as a person. What were his thoughts? What were his dreams? Did he believe genuinely that the throne should be his, or was he simply an ambitious man who saw an opportunity? The chroniclers who recorded his rebellion painted him as a villain, naturally. But history is rarely so simple. What we know for certain is this. Æthelwold was the son of Æthelred I, Alfred's older brother, who had ruled Wessex before Alfred. When Æthelred died in 871, his sons, Æthelwold and his brother Æthelhelm, had been too young to rule. Alfred had taken the throne instead, and he had held it for 28 years. Now Alfred was dead, and Æthelwold was no longer a child. He was a grown man, and he believed the kingship should have been his father's lines all along. Within weeks of Alfred's death, perhaps even within days, Æthelwold acted. He seized the royal estate at Wimborne in Dorset, where his father lay buried. This was deeply symbolic. By taking Wimborne, Æthelwold was claiming his father's legacy, standing quite literally on his father's grave and demanding recognition. But Æthelwold didn't stop there. He also took control of Christchurch, another important royal estate. And then he did something that shocked Saxon society. He abducted a nun. The identity of this nun is uncertain. Some historians believe she might have been Edward's sister, Æthelflæd, who was an abbess at Shaftesbury. If so, then Æthelwold's plan may have been to marry her, thus strengthening his claim through alliance with Alfred's family. Or perhaps she was simply a woman of importance, whose capture demonstrated Æthelwold's defiance of both secular and sacred law. Edward responded swiftly. He assembled an army and marched to Badbury Rings, an ancient hill fort near Wimborne. Here he halted, his forces arrayed for battle. Messengers went back and forth. Æthelwold sent word that he would die at Wimborne if necessary. He would not surrender, would not abandon his claim. Edward prepared to attack, but when his forces moved forward, they found Wimborne empty. In the dead of night, Æthelwold had fled. He rode north, out of Wessex entirely, into the Danelaw, into enemy territory. The Northumbrian Vikings welcomed him. Think about what this meant. Æthelwold, a Saxon prince, a Christian nobleman, a man of Alfred's own blood, had joined with the Vikings, who had spent decades trying to destroy Wessex. To Saxon minds, this was the ultimate betrayal. Æthelwold had not just abandoned his people, he had joined their enemies, had made common cause with pagans and raiders, had chosen ambition over every bond of kinship and faith. The Northumbrian Danes proclaimed Æthelwold as king. According to one version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, they accepted him as their lord and king. Now Æthelwold had an army. Now he had Viking warriors at his command, men who had spent their lives fighting, who saw Wessex not as a kingdom to be preserved, but as wealth to be taken. Meanwhile, back in Wessex, Edward moved forward with his coronation. On June 8, 900, at Kingston upon Thames, Edward was formally crowned king of the Anglo-Saxons. Kingston was a significant choice. It sat on the border between Wessex and Mercia, symbolizing Edward's claim to rule both kingdoms in the alliance his father had forged. The ceremony would have been solemn, filled with prayers and oaths and the ritual anointing with holy oil. Bishops blessed him. Nobles swore their loyalty. But everyone present knew that Æthelwold was out there waiting, building his strength, preparing to strike. For a year, there was an uneasy peace. Edward consolidated his position. He confirmed his father's arrangements with the church, donated to monasteries, met with his ealdormen and advisers. He completed the new minster at Winchester, a church his father had commissioned, but not lived to see finished. In a telling gesture, Edward moved Alfred's body from the old minster to this new church, creating a royal mausoleum for his father. Soon, his mother Æthelflæd would be buried there too. But this peace could not last. Æthelwold and his Viking allies were not content to remain in the north. They wanted more. They wanted Wessex itself. In 901, Æthelwold came south with a fleet. He sailed to Essex, to the lands where Danish and Saxon populations mixed, where loyalties were complicated and old allegiances could be turned with promises of gold or glory. The East Anglian Danes joined him. Their king, Yorick, brought his own forces to swell Æthelwold's army. This was no longer just a succession dispute. This was war. Æthelwold's forces raided into Mercia and the northern parts of Wessex. They burned villages, killed anyone who resisted, took livestock and slaves and anything of value. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the devastation in terse, grim lines. Edward had to respond, but he faced a terrible dilemma. To fight Æthelwold meant to fight Vikings in their own territory, in the Danelaw where Danish law prevailed and Saxon armies had no inherent right to operate. It meant risking everything in a pitched battle, where the outcome could never be certain. Edward chose to fight. He gathered his forces and marched north, into East Anglia, into the very heart of the Danelaw. His army ravaged the countryside just as Æthelwold's had ravaged Wessex and Mercia. This was the brutal logic of medieval warfare. Your enemy hurts you, so you hurt them back, and you do it hard enough that they will think twice before attacking again. For weeks, the armies manoeuvred. Edward pushed deep into East Anglia, further than his father had ever dared to go. He was sending a message. I am not afraid of you. I will bring war to your lands if you bring war to mine. And then Edward made a decision that would haunt him. He ordered a retreat. Perhaps he felt his army had done enough damage. Perhaps supplies were running low. Perhaps he received intelligence that another threat was emerging elsewhere. Whatever the reason, Edward commanded his forces to pull back, to return to Wessex before winter made campaigning impossible. Most of his army obeyed, but not the men of Kent. The Kentish contingent of Edward's force, whether through miscommunication or deliberate disobedience or simple recklessness, did not retreat when ordered. They remained in East Anglian territory, still raiding, still fighting. And Æthelwold, seeing his opportunity, attacked them. The Battle of Holme, fought on December 13th, 902, should have been a minor skirmish, a portion of Edward's army, caught by surprise, facing a larger Viking force. The outcome should have been obvious. But warfare is never predictable, and fate has a way of turning on unexpected moments. The exact location of Holme is uncertain. Most historians believe it was Holme in Huntingdonshire, though some argue for other sites. What we know for certain is that on a cold December day, as winter's grip tightened on England, two armies met in a place whose very name would be forgotten by history. Even as the battle fought, there changed everything. The Kentish warriors knew they were in danger. They had disobeyed their king's order to retreat, whether intentionally or through confusion. Now they found themselves isolated, deep in enemy territory, with Æthelwold's combined force of Northumbrian Vikings and East Anglian Danes bearing down on them. According to later accounts, Edward sent 7 messages to the Kentish Fyrd, desperately trying to get them to withdraw and rejoin the main army. 7 times his messengers rode to find the Kentish warriors. 7 times they delivered the king's urgent command: fall back, return, do not fight this, battle. And 7 times the message arrived too late, or was ignored, or could not be obeyed because events had moved too quickly. Æthelwold's army came upon the Kentish warriors in force. The Saxon shield wall formed, that ancient formation that had defended Germanic peoples for centuries. Warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, spears bristling forward like the spines of some massive beast. The Vikings attacked. Medieval battles were horrific in ways that are difficult for us to truly grasp. This was not warfare at a distance, not arrows and cannon fire from safe positions. This was men standing close enough to smell each other's breath, close enough to see the terror and rage in each other's eyes, swinging axes and swords and spears with desperate strength, trying to break through the enemy's line before the enemy broke through theirs. The noise must have been overwhelming. The clash of metal, on wood, on bone, the screams of the wounded, the bellowed war cries, the harsh breathing of men pushing forward with every ounce of strength they possessed. The Kentish warriors fought with the fury of men who knew they were outnumbered and could expect no mercy. Saxon warriors prided themselves on courage, on never fleeing from battle, on dying well if death was inevitable. The warrior culture that Edward had absorbed through countless nights listening to Old English poems was not some abstract ideal. It was the code that these men lived and died by. But courage could not overcome numbers. The Vikings pressed forward. The Saxon line buckled. Warriors fell. Among those who fell was Sigerhelm, an ealdorman of Kent. His name would matter later. His daughter, Edgifu, would become Edward's 3rd wife, meaning that Edward would later marry into the family of a man who died in this battle, fighting under Edward's command. Another Saxon noble, Sigurwulf, also fell. These were not common soldiers but leaders, wealthy landowners, men whose deaths meant that entire estates would pass to widows and children, men whose loss would be felt across their communities. The Vikings too paid a heavy price. Æthelwold himself died in the fighting. The sources don't tell us exactly how, whether he was cut down by a spear, or whether an axe split his skull, or whether he was trampled in the chaos of combat. But die he did, and with him died the succession crisis that had threatened Edward's throne. King Eoric of East Anglia also fell at home. This was enormous. Eoric had ruled the East Anglian Danes for years, and his death created a power vacuum in one of the most important Viking kingdoms in England. A Northumbrian prince named Brightside, son of an Ætheling called Beornoth, was killed. 2 Danish holds, military leaders named Æsopa and Oscatel, died as well. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that the Danes kept the place of slaughter, which typically meant that the Vikings had won the battle, that they had held the field while the Saxons retreated or were driven off. In the brutal calculus of medieval warfare, the side that held the battlefield at the end could claim victory. But this was a victory that felt like defeat. The Vikings had lost their king. Æthelwold, the man who had brought together this whole alliance, who had promised his Danish allies wealth and glory if they helped him take Wessex, lay dead. The entire purpose of the campaign had been to put Æthelwold on the throne. And now Æthelwold no longer existed to be put anywhere. When news of the battle reached Edward, he must have felt a complex swirl of emotions. Relief, certainly. His cousin was dead. The succession crisis was over. No one else had the claim or the audacity to challenge him, but also grief, perhaps, because Æthelwold had been family, had been someone Edward grew up knowing, and guilt, too, over the Kentish warriors who had died because his orders had not reached them in time or had not been obeyed. Medieval kings did not have the luxury of showing weakness. Edward could not publicly mourn his cousin or express doubt about his decisions. He had to project strength, confidence, absolute authority. So he did what kings did. He moved forward, consolidated his position, negotiated from the strength that Æthelwold's death had given him. In the aftermath of Holme, Edward negotiated a peace treaty with the East Anglian Danes. The exact terms of this treaty are lost to us, but we can infer its general shape. The Danes would remain in East Anglia, ruling their own territory under their own laws. Edward would not attempt to conquer them. Not yet. In return, they would not raid into Wessex or Mercia. They would respect the boundaries that Alfred had established. This was a pragmatic peace, born of mutual exhaustion. Neither side had the strength to destroy the other, so they agreed to coexist, at least for a time. Edward also had to deal with the families of the men who had died at home. In a society bound by ties of kinship and obligation, a king owed something to the widows and children of warriors who fell in his service. There would have been payments to make, estates to redistribute, oaths to swear that the sacrifices of these men would not be forgotten. And Edward had to think about his own legacy. He was now secure on the throne, but being secure was not enough. His father had not just held Wessex, he had expanded it, had taken territory from the Vikings, had built the fortifications and systems that made Saxon England strong enough to resist. If Edward wanted to be remembered as more than just Alfred's son, he would need to achieve something equally great. But first, he needed to build, to strengthen, to prepare. The decade after Holme was a time of consolidation. Edward focused on internal affairs, on making Wessex prosperous and secure. He continued his father's policy of building and maintaining burhs, those fortified towns that served as both defensive, strongpoints and economic centres. Winchester, already important, became even more central to his rule. He completed the new minster there, creating a magnificent church that stood beside the ancient old minster, the two buildings almost touching, competing for prominence. There was something almost petty in this architectural rivalry. The monks of the old minster had been Alfred's allies, but they seem to have been less enthusiastic about Edward. Some historians speculate that they resented Edward's attempts to control them, or that they preferred his cousin's claim, or that there were simply personality conflicts we can no longer discern. Whatever the reason, Edward responded by building his own minster, his own church, creating a new religious centre loyal to him personally. He moved his father's body from the old minster to the new minster, and when his mother, Ælfswyth, died on December 5th, 902, he buried her in the new minster as well. This was Edward's statement. The new minster was the royal mausoleum, the place where the kings and queens of Wessex would rest. The old minster might be ancient, but the new minster was the future. Edward's second marriage, to Æthelflæd, daughter of Ealdorman Æthelhelm, produced a stream of children in these years. Medieval royal families were large by necessity. Childhood mortality was high, and having many children was the only way to ensure that at least some would survive to adulthood. Edward would father at least 14 children by 3 wives over his lifetime, an enormous brood by any standard. His eldest son, Æthelstan, was not raised at Edward's court. Instead, the boy was fostered in Mercia, at the court of Edward's sister Æthelflæd and her husband Æthelred. This was both a political statement and a practical arrangement. By raising Æthelstan in Mercia, Edward ensured that his heir would understand and be accepted by the Mercians. Æthelflæd, who had no son of her own, doted on her nephew. Æthelstan grew up learning Mercian ways, making Mercian friends, becoming as much a Mercian prince as a West Saxon one. But Æthelstan's brothers, Ælfwerd and the sons of Edward's later marriages, grew up in Wessex at their father's court. This would matter enormously later, when Edward died, and the question of succession arose again. In 906, Edward negotiated another treaty with the Danes, this one called the Peace of Tiddingford. The treaty updated the arrangements that Alfred had made decades earlier with the Viking leader Guthrum. It defined borders, regulated trade, established laws for how disputes between Saxons and Danes should be resolved. For 3 years, this peace held. But peace in early medieval England was always fragile, always temporary. In 909, Edward and his brother-in-law Æthelred, Lord of the Mercians, decided to raid into Viking territory. Their target was Bardney, a monastery in Lindsey, a region that had once been Mercian, but was now firmly part of the Danelaw. This monastery held the relics of St. Oswald, an ancient Northumbrian king who had been martyred fighting pagans centuries earlier. This raid had multiple purposes. On one level, it was simple theft, taking valuable relics that could bring prestige and pilgrims to Mercian churches. But it was also a statement: we can strike into your territory whenever we wish. We are not afraid of you. The Mercian forces rode into Bardney, seized St. Oswald's bones, and rode back out again. They took the relics to Gloucester, where Æthelred and Æthelflæd had built a new minster, and enshrined them there with great ceremony. Gloucester now had a major saint's relics, which meant it would attract pilgrims, which meant wealth and prestige. The Danes were furious. Edward and Æthelred had violated the Peace of Tiddingford, had raided into the Danelaw during a time of supposed peace. The Vikings would not let this insult stand. In 910, a massive Viking army assembled. Warriors from Northumbria, led by their kings Halfdan and Æthelwold, gathered their forces. A third leader, Ingwer, brought his own contingent. Together they commanded thousands of warriors, all hungry for revenge, all eager to plunder the rich Saxon lands to the south. They came by ship down the River Severn, striking deep into the heart of Mercia. Edward was away in Kent, waiting for his own fleet to assemble. When news of the Viking invasion reached him, Æthelred's forces in Mercia were unprepared, caught off guard by the scale and speed of the attack. The Vikings ravaged the countryside. They burned villages, took slaves, stole livestock, killed anyone who tried to resist. Smoke rose from 100 burning farms. Refugees fled before the Viking advance, carrying what little they could, leaving everything else to be looted or destroyed. It seemed as though the dark days of Alfred's early reign had returned, as though all the work of building and fortifying and creating stability was about to be undone in one catastrophic invasion. But Edward was not Alfred, and the situation in 910 was not the same as it had been in the 870s. Edward moved with a speed that caught the Vikings completely off guard. When Edward received word that a massive Viking army had invaded Mercia, he did not panic. He did not waste time in councils or deliberation. He acted. His fleet in Kent would have to wait. This invasion could not be allowed to succeed. If the Vikings ravaged Mercia unchecked, if they broke the Saxon resistance in the Midlands, then everything Alfred had built, everything Edward had fought to preserve, would be destroyed. Edward sent urgent messages north, calling for the West Saxon fyrd to assemble. The fyrd was the militia system that Alfred had reformed. All free men owed military service to their lord and their king, and when the king called, they came. Farmers and craftsmen and merchants, men who spent most of their lives working the land or plying their trades, grabbed their spears and shields and marched to join the king's army. At the same time, Æthelred was assembling the Mercian forces. Despite being caught off guard by the initial Viking attack, the Mercian defences held. This was a testament to the reforms that Æthelred and Æthelflæd had been implementing. the network of burhs, the organized militia, the system of beacons and messengers that could spread warnings quickly. The Vikings, believing they had surprised their enemies, spent time plundering. They moved slowly, weighed down with loot, slaves, and stolen livestock. They thought they had weeks to ravage Mercia before any serious Saxon response could materialize. They were wrong. Edward's forces and Æthelred's forces joined together somewhere in the Midlands. The exact meeting point is lost to history, but what matters is that they united, creating an army large enough to challenge the Vikings in open battle. The Vikings, hearing that a Saxon army was approaching, began to retreat northward. They had their plunder. Better to return to the Danelaw with wealth than to risk it all in a pitched battle. They loaded their ships and began the journey back up the Severn, then overland toward the safety of their own territories. Edward pursued them. Day after day, the Saxon army followed the Viking host, shadowing their movements, waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment came near a place called Tettenhall in Staffordshire on August 5th, 910. The lady and her brother, before we can truly understand the Battle of Tettenhall and all that followed, we must pause and speak of Æthelflæd, for no account of Edward's reign is complete without understanding his sister. Æthelflæd, later known as the Lady of the Mercians, was born around 869 or 870, making her perhaps 4 or 5 years older than Edward. She was Alfred's eldest child, and from the beginning, she was remarkable. Alfred had arranged her marriage around 886, when she was perhaps 16 years old. Her husband was Æthelred, the ealdorman who ruled western Mercia, the portion of the ancient Mercian kingdom that remained under Saxon control after the Vikings had carved away the east. This marriage was political, of course, as all royal marriages were in that era. Alfred needed Mercia as an ally, and binding his daughter to Mercia's ruler sealed that alliance in blood and kinship. But Æthelflæd was no mere diplomatic pawn. Contemporary sources treat her with a respect rarely accorded to women of that era. Unlike in Wessex, where queens had limited power and were not even granted the title of queen, Mercia had a tradition of powerful royal women. Æthelflæd's mother-in-law had been Æthelwold, who had witnessed charters as queen and made grants in her own name. Æthelflæd and Æthelred had one child, a daughter named Ælfwine, born sometime in the early 890s, and then, according to later sources, Æthelflæd nearly died in childbirth. The experience was so traumatic that she vowed never to have sexual relations again. She took a vow of chastity, even though she remained married to Æthelred. Whether this story is true or a later invention, we cannot know for certain. What we do know is that Æthelflæd had only one child, which was unusual for a royal couple in an age where large families were the norm, and we know that Æthelflæd increasingly took on roles that were typically reserved for men. By the early 900s, perhaps even by the late 890s, Æthelflæd was effectively ruling Mercia. Her husband Æthelred fell ill. Irish annals record that he was in disease by 902, unable to lead armies or manage the day-to-day affairs of government. While Æthelred lived until 911, for the last decade of his life he was largely incapacitated. Æthelflæd stepped into the void. She led armies, she made treaties, she built fortifications. Contemporary chroniclers, struggling to describe a woman wielding such power, simply called her the Lady of the Mercians, Merkna Hlefdig in Old English. Not queen, because that would violate Saxon customs, but not just a noble woman either. Something in between, something unprecedented, and she was brilliant at it. Æthelflæd understood warfare in ways that few of her contemporaries did. She grasped that victory came not from single great battles, but from strategic control of territory. She and Æthelred, and later she alone, continued and expanded Alfred's program of building burhs. Fortress after fortress rose across Mercia. Bridgnorth in 912, Stafford and Tamworth in 913, Edisbury and Warwick in 914, Cherbury and Runcorn in 915. Each burh was positioned to control key routes, to provide refuge for local populations, to serve as a base for military operations. The partnership between Edward and Æthelflæd was the foundation of everything that followed. Brother and sister, king and lady, they coordinated their campaigns with precision that seems remarkable even centuries later. When Edward built fortresses in the south, Æthelflæd built them in the Midlands. When Edward attacked the Vikings in East Anglia, Æthelflæd struck at the Danish strongholds in her own territory. They communicated constantly, planned together, supported each other. There's no evidence that they ever quarreled over authority or competed for glory. This was not a rivalry, but a genuine partnership, rooted in shared purpose and perhaps genuine affection. They had been raised together, educated together, had spent their childhoods in the dangerous years when Wessex seemed on the brink of destruction. They understood what was at stake. After Ethelred's death in 911, Æthelflæd's position became even more extraordinary. The Mercian nobles accepted her as their sole ruler. This is shocking when you understand Anglo-Saxon society. Women did not rule kingdoms. They could be regents for young sons, yes, or they could wield influence behind the scenes, but they did not lead armies and make treaties and build fortresses in their own names. Yet the Mercians accepted Æthelflæd. Perhaps it was because she had been ruling effectively for years already. Perhaps it was because she was competent in ways that inspired confidence. Perhaps it was because her brother Edward was so obviously willing to work with her rather than against her, and the Mercians needed that alliance with Wessex to survive. Or perhaps, and this is where we enter the realm of speculation, perhaps the Mercian nobles accepted Æthelflæd because they saw her as a compromise. Æthelred had been their ealdorman, not their king. Mercia had been conquered by Vikings, stripped of its royal family, reduced to a client state of Wessex. By accepting Æthelflæd, who was Alfred's daughter and Edward's sister, the Mercians maintained a degree of autonomy. They had their own ruler, even if she was from the West Saxon royal house. The alternative would have been for Edward to simply absorb Mercia into Wessex, ruling it directly as his father had ruled it under the fiction of Æthelred's ealdormanship. Æthelflæd gave Mercia something to be proud of. Under her leadership, Mercian armies won victories. Mercian fortresses protected Mercian people. Mercia was not just a subordinate ally of Wessex, it was a power in its own right, even if everyone understood that Edward was the senior partner in the relationship. The sources from Mercia treat Æthelflæd with reverence. The Mercian Register, a series of annals preserved in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that focus on Mercian events, records her deeds with care and respect. In this year, by the grace of God, Æthelflæd, Lady of the Mercians, went with all the Mercians to Tamworth and built the fortress there. One entry reads. Another notes that she built the fortress at Stafford. Each entry emphasizes that she acted with the support of the Mercians, that she led them rather than merely commanding them. William of Malmesbury, writing in the 12th century based on sources now lost to us, called her a powerful accession to Edward's party, the delight of her subjects, the dread of her enemies, a woman of enlarged soul. He wrote that she protected her own men and terrified aliens. This was not the language used to describe a woman who sat in a castle while men did the fighting. This was the language used to describe a warrior leader. In 916, Æthelflæd demonstrated just how formidable she could be. An abbot named Egbert, travelling in the Welsh kingdom of Brycheiniog, was murdered along with his companions on June 16th, the feast day of St. Cyriac the Martyr. The killing was unprovoked, brutal, an insult to both Mercian authority and Christian sanctity. Egbert had been under Æthelflæd's protection, and his murder could not go unanswered. 3 days later, Æthelflæd invaded Wales with an army. Her forces ravaged Brycheiniog, burning settlements, destroying crops, making the Welsh pay dearly for Egbert's murder. King Tudor of Brycheiniog fled, but his wife, Queen Angharad, was captured along with 33 others, many of them royal relatives. Eventually, King Tudor submitted. He swore to serve Æthelflæd faithfully and to pay compensation for the murder. Wales had learned what Mercia's enemies were learning. The Lady of the Mercians was not someone to be trifled with, but Æthelflæd's greatest achievements came in her campaigns against the Danish strongholds in the Midlands. In 917, she captured Derby, which held a Danish garrison. In 918, she took Leicester, and by mid-918, the city of York, the great Danish stronghold in the north, was negotiating to submit to her authority. York, the capital of Viking Northumbria, the seat of Danish power in northern England. They were preparing to recognize a woman as their overlord. This is where Æthelflæd's story becomes unbearably poignant. She was on the verge of her greatest triumph. York's submission would mean that all of the Danelaw south of the Humber, and potentially even Northumbria itself, would acknowledge Mercian overlordship. Combined with Edward's conquests in the south, this would mean that Saxon authority extended over virtually all of what would become England. Alfred's dream of a unified English kingdom was about to become reality, and Æthelflæd would be remembered as one of its chief architects. But on June 12, 918, just 12 days before midsummer, Æthelflæd died at Tamworth. She was around 48 years old. The cause of her death is not recorded. It may have been illness, or an accident, or simply the accumulated exhaustion of a lifetime spent in war and governance. Medieval people age faster than we do, worn down by poor nutrition and constant stress and injuries that never quite healed. Her body was taken to Gloucester, to the minster she and Æthelred had built, the church that held St. Oswald's relics. She was buried there in the east porch of St. Peter's Church, in a place of honour, mourned by the Mercians who had followed her for so long. Her daughter Elfwin briefly succeeded her as Lady of the Mercians. For a few months, it seemed as though Mercia would continue to have its own ruler, that Æthelflæd's legacy would endure. But Edward had other plans. Let us return now to August 1st, 910, and to the moment when everything changed. The Viking army, laden with plunder from their raid through Mercia, was retreating northward toward the safety of the Danelaw. Behind them came the combined forces of Wessex and Mercia, Edward's warriors and Æthelred's warriors, moving together, coordinating their pursuit with the precision that would later characterize all of Edward and Æthelflæd's joint campaigns. The Vikings had to know they were being followed. They must have seen the dust raised by the Saxon army's march, must have received reports from scouts. They could have abandoned their plunder and fled at top speed. But medieval warfare operated under different assumptions than modern warfare. Running away without fighting, leaving your loot behind, marked you as a coward. And besides, the Vikings were confident. They outnumbered the Saxon forces, or at least believed they did. They had 3 kings leading them, Halfdan, Æthelwold, and Ingvar. They had warriors who had been raiding for decades, who had won countless battles, who feared no enemy, so they chose to fight. The 2 armies met near Tettenhall in Staffordshire. The exact location is debated by historians, but it was probably on elevated ground, a place where shield walls could form, where cavalry couldn't maneuver easily, where the battle would come down to strength and courage, and which line broke first. The Saxons had several advantages. First, they were defending their homeland, fighting to protect their families and communities. Second, They had the element of surprise. They had moved faster than the Vikings expected, catching the raiders before they could properly prepare for battle. Third, and most important, they had unified command. Edward and Æthelred fought together, their forces integrated, operating as a single army rather than two separate contingents. The Vikings, by contrast, had three kings, each with his own followers, each with his own ideas about tactics and strategy. Medieval armies were collections of war bands, each following their own lord. Coordinating them was always difficult. The battle began with the traditional exchange of missiles, arrows, javelins, throwing axes. Men fell on both sides, pierced by projectiles, dying before they could even close with the enemy. Then the shield walls crashed together. This was the moment when battles were won or lost in the early medieval period. Two lines of men, shields locked together, pushing forward with all their strength, while simultaneously trying to stab around and over their shields at the enemies pressing against them. It was exhausting work. Men could only fight at full intensity for minutes at a time before they needed to be rotated back, replaced by fresh warriors. The Saxon line held. Edward and Æthelred had trained their men well. The West Saxon and Mercian warriors pushed forward, step by step, forcing the Vikings back. The Vikings fought desperately. They had nowhere to retreat to. The Saxon army was between them and their ships. If they broke and ran, they would be cut down. So they fought, and they died, and they fought some more. King Halfdan fell. Sources don't record exactly how, but a Danish king was a warrior first and foremost, expected to fight in the front ranks where the danger was greatest. Halfdan died doing what he had done his entire life, fighting Saxons, trying to win glory and wealth through the strength of his arm. King Æthelwold fell, another leader gone, another focus of resistance eliminated. The Viking line began to crack. Warriors who had stood firm moments before now looked around, saw their kings dead, saw their companions falling, and began to think about survival rather than victory. The Saxons pressed their advantage. They pushed forward into the gaps opening in the Viking line. They struck down anyone who tried to rally the Danish forces. They showed no mercy, because mercy in battle meant giving your enemy a chance to kill you. The Viking army broke. What followed was the most dangerous part of any medieval battle, the pursuit. When one side broke and ran, the other side chased them down, killing as many as possible before the survivors could escape. A routed army was helpless. Men threw away their weapons and shields to run faster. They scattered, each warrior thinking only of his own survival. And the victors hunted them through the countryside, spearing them in the back, cutting them down from behind. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that several thousand Vikings died at Tettenhall. In an age when armies numbered in the hundreds or low thousands, this was catastrophic. An entire generation of Viking warriors gone in a single afternoon. King Halfdan, dead. King Æthelwold, dead. Ingvar's fate is unrecorded, but he likely died too, or fled north never to raid again. Multiple earls and chieftains, all dead. The Viking army of Northumbria, the force that had terrorized Saxon England for decades, had been shattered. Edward and Æthelred had won the most decisive Saxon victory over the Vikings in a generation. The consequences were immediate and profound. The Vikings of Northumbria, leaderless and broken, retreated to their strongholds and stayed there. They would not launch another major raid into Mercia or Wessex for years. The threat from the north, the constant danger that had hung over every Saxon king since the 860s, had been neutralized. But more than that, Tettenhall demonstrated that Saxon armies could not just defend against Viking attacks, but could actively defeat them in open battle. This was psychological warfare as much as military reality. The Vikings, who had spent decades believing themselves superior warriors, who had conquered kingdoms and destroyed armies, who had made the word Viking synonymous with terror. They had been beaten decisively by the Saxons they had always dismissed as inferior. Edward's reputation soared. He was no longer just Alfred's son, no longer the king who had barely held onto his throne against his cousin's challenge. He was Edward the victorious, Edward the warrior, Edward who had avenged decades of Viking raids in a single battle. And perhaps most important for Edward personally, he had proven himself worthy of his sister. Æthelflæd had been governing Mercia effectively for years by this point, had been the real power behind her husband's declining health. She had built fortresses and led armies and made Mercia strong again. Now Edward had shown that he too could lead, could win, could transform the strategic situation with a single bold stroke. The partnership between brother and sister, already close, became even stronger. They had fought together at Tettenhall. They had shared in the victory. And now, with the Viking threat subdued, they could turn their attention to something more ambitious than mere survival. They could think about conquest. In the years after Tettenhall, Edward and Æthelflæd transformed the map of England. They began slowly, methodically, building fortifications first before attempting to conquer territory. This was Alfred's strategy perfected. Secure what you hold before trying to take what you don't. In 912, Edward focused on the borderlands between Wessex and the Danelaw. He built a fortress at Hertford, controlling the strategic approaches from East Anglia. He fortified towns in Essex, creating a network of strongpoints that would make any Viking raid from the east costly and difficult. Each burh followed a similar pattern. The king or his representatives would identify a strategic location, usually a place that controlled a river crossing or a main road, somewhere that had natural defensive advantages. Then workers would be assembled, hundreds or thousands of them, labourers who owed service to the king. They dug ditches and piled earth into ramparts. They built wooden palisades on top of the earthworks. They created gatehouses and towers. Inside the fortifications, a small garrison of warriors would be stationed permanently, maintained by taxes from the surrounding countryside. But the real strength of the Boer system was that, in times of danger, the entire local population could retreat into the fortress. Farmers could drive their livestock inside the walls. Merchants could shelter their goods. Families could huddle together while Viking raiders raged impotently outside, unable to break through the defences. This made raiding unprofitable. Vikings could no longer simply sail up a river, burn an undefended village, take slaves and treasure, and sail away. Now there were fortresses everywhere, and any raiding party risked being trapped between multiple Saxon armies operating from secure bases. Æthelflæd was doing the same thing in Mercia. Her fortress-building program was even more extensive than Edward's. She built at Skirget, location now unknown, and Bridgenorth in 912. In 913, she fortified Stafford and Tamworth, ancient centres of Mercian royal power, now transformed into military strongholds. In 914, she built at Edisbury and Warwick. In 915, at Cherbury and Runcorn. Each fortress extended Mercian control further, pushed back Danish territory, created safe zones where Saxon law and Saxon customs could prevail. The Danes watched this happening and understood what it meant. Edward and Æthelflæd were not just defending anymore. They were preparing for invasion, for conquest, for the systematic reconquest of all the territories the Vikings had seized decades earlier. Some Danish leaders chose to negotiate. Better to submit now, keep their lands and their lives, than to fight and risk losing everything. Others prepared to resist, gathering their warriors, strengthening their own fortifications, making alliances with other Danish strongholds. In 916, while Edward built fortifications in the south, Æthelflæd launched her Welsh campaign. demonstrating that Mercia could fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. The message to the Danes was clear: we are strong enough to fight you and everyone else at the same time. Then, in 917, Edward and Æthelflæd launched their great offensive. Edward struck into Essex and East Anglia with overwhelming force. His armies moved from burh to burh, each fortress serving as a base for operations, a place to regroup and resupply, before pushing forward again. Danish strongholds fell one after another. Some resisted and were stormed, their defenders killed or captured. Others, seeing the size of the Saxon forces and knowing that help was not coming, surrendered. The East Anglian Danes tried to mount a coordinated resistance, but Edward's strategy had fractured them. They couldn't mass their forces because Edward's fortresses controlled all the key routes. When they tried to gather an army, Saxon forces would strike from multiple directions, forcing the Danes to disperse before they could become a serious threat. By the end of 917, Edward controlled all of Essex and most of East Anglia. Entire Danish communities found themselves now living under Saxon rule, subject to Saxon law, required to swear loyalty to a Saxon king. At the same time, Æthelflæd was conquering the Danish strongholds in the Midlands. In 917, her armies took Derby, which had been a major Danish garrison town. The capture of Derby was particularly significant because it had been one of the 5 boroughs: Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham, and Stamford, the 5 fortified Danish towns that formed the core of Viking power in the East Midlands. In 918, Æthelflæd captured Leicester without a fight. The Danish garrison there, seeing what had happened to Derby, knowing that resistance was futile, chose to surrender rather than die defending walls that wouldn't hold. 4 of the 5 boroughs had now fallen to the Saxons. Only Lincoln remained, and its garrison was negotiating surrender as well. But the greatest prize was still ahead: York itself, the capital of Viking Northumbria, the seat of Danish kings, the strongest fortress in the north. York had never fallen to Saxon attack, not in all the decades since the Vikings had first conquered Northumbria. Yet by mid-918, York was negotiating to submit to Æthelflæd's authority. Think about what this meant. A Viking city, a stronghold that had resisted every Saxon attempt to reconquer it, was preparing to accept a woman as its overlord. The Danes of York were not doing this because they loved the Saxons or because they had suddenly converted to Christianity and decided to embrace their former enemies. They were doing it because Æthelflæd had broken Danish power so thoroughly in the Midlands that York's garrison recognized they could not stand alone. The Saxons to the south were unified, organized, commanded by brilliant leaders who coordinated their campaigns with precision. The Danes, by contrast, were fragmented, each stronghold operating independently, unable to help each other. York could see the future. Either submit now on terms that might preserve some autonomy, or fight and be conquered, with all that implied for the lives and property of York's inhabitants. Æthelflæd would have ridden north to receive York's submission personally. She would have entered the city in triumph, the first Saxon ruler to do so in decades. It would have been the crowning achievement of her extraordinary career, the moment when she secured her legacy as one of England's greatest warrior leaders. But Æthelflæd never reached York. June 12th, 918. Tamworth. The Mercian register records it simply, starkly. This year, in the early part of the year, by God's help, she peacefully got into her power the fortress at Leicester, and the greater part of the army, which owed obedience thereto, became subject to her. And the people of York had also covenanted with her, some having given a pledge, and some having bound themselves by oath, that they would be at her command. But very shortly after they had become so, she died at Tamworth, 12 days before midsummer. Æthelflæd was dead. The cause is not recorded. She was around 48 years old, not young, but not impossibly old either. Medieval people died from things we consider minor today: infections from wounds or cuts, diseases that modern medicine could treat easily, complications from old injuries that had never healed properly. Or perhaps it was something more sudden: a stroke, a heart attack, an aneurysm. We will never know. What we do know is that Mercia mourned her. She was buried at Gloucester, in the minster she had helped build, in the church that held St. Oswald's relics. Mercian nobles would have attended the funeral, along with Edward and his chief advisors from Wessex. The burial would have been grand, befitting a ruler who had led her people for nearly a decade. Edward's reaction to his sister's death is not recorded. Medieval chroniclers didn't dwell on emotions the way modern historians might wish, but we can infer something of what he must have felt. This was his closest ally, his partner in everything he had accomplished since Tettenhall. They had coordinated campaigns, planned strategy together, supported each other through crisis after crisis. More than that, she was family. Not just his sister, but someone who had shared his childhood, who had grown up with him in their father's court, who understood as no one else could what it meant to be Alfred's child. Her death left a hole in Edward's world that nothing could fill. Æthelflæd's daughter Ælfwine succeeded her mother as Lady of the Mercians. This succession was apparently uncontroversial initially. Ælfwine was around 25 years old, well past the age when women typically married and managed households. She had been raised at Æthelflæd's court, had watched her mother govern, presumably had learned statecraft and administration. For several months, Ælfwine ruled Mercia. Sources give us almost no information about these months, which probably means they were relatively peaceful. If there had been major crises or dramatic events, the chroniclers would have recorded them. But Edward was making plans. In early December 918, Edward marched into Mercia with an army. He did not come as an ally or a guest. He came as a conqueror. He seized Ælfwine and carried her off to Wessex. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states boldly, "The daughter of Æthelred, lord of the Mercians, was deprived of all dominion over the Mercians and carried into Wessex 3 weeks before midwinter." Ælfwine disappears from history after this. Some later sources claim she was forced to become a nun, confined in a convent where she could not threaten Edward's authority. Others suggest she may have been imprisoned. We don't know if she lived another 50 years or died within months. She vanishes from the historical record as completely as if she had never existed. Edward's seizure of Mercia was ruthless, efficient and necessary, at least from his perspective. Mercia without Æthelflæd's strong leadership was vulnerable. The Danes had submitted to Æthelflæd personally, attracted by her military prowess and her reputation. Would they remain loyal to her inexperienced daughter? Unlikely. More probably, they would see Ælfwine's succession as an opportunity to rebel, to regain their independence, to undo all that Æthelflæd had achieved. Edward could not allow that. He had spent 8 years fighting alongside his sister to reconquer the Danelaw. He was not going to watch that work unravel because Mercia had a weak ruler. Moreover, Edward needed Mercia's resources for the campaigns that still lay ahead. Northumbria remained unconquered. The Vikings of York had been willing to submit to Æthelflæd, but would they submit to Edward? That remained to be seen. And there were still Danish strongholds scattered across the north, still Viking warriors who would resist Saxon rule if they thought they had any chance of success. So Edward absorbed Mercia into his kingdom. He did not make himself king of Mercia. That would have been too provocative, would have suggested the conquest of a separate kingdom. Instead, he simply extended his authority as king of the Anglo-Saxons to cover Mercia as well as Wessex. The Mercian nobles had little choice but to accept this. Edward commanded overwhelming military force. More important, He was Æthelflæd's brother. He was Alfred's son. He had Mercian blood through his mother. He was not some foreign conqueror, but family, someone who understood Mercian traditions and Mercian pride. Still, the Mercian register records Ælfwin's deposition with resentment. The annalist was clearly unhappy with Edward's action, clearly felt that Mercia had been wronged. This resentment would linger for years, occasionally flaring into open rebellion. But for now, Edward had achieved something remarkable. He ruled all of England south of the Humber. Wessex, Mercia, Essex, East Anglia, all answered to him. The Danish settlers in these territories lived under his authority, governed by his laws, required to contribute to his armies. This was the largest extent of territory under a single Saxon ruler's control since before the Viking invasions began in the 860s. Edward had accomplished what his father had only dreamed of. He had unified southern England. Yet Edward was not satisfied. Northumbria still remained. York, the great Viking stronghold, still held out. The Scots to the north, the Welsh to the west, the Norsemen in Ireland who sometimes raided the western coasts. All these potential enemies still threatened Saxon England's borders. Edward could not rest, could not declare victory and enjoy the fruits of conquest. There was always another campaign, always another threat, always more work to be done. In 920, Edward marched north. He went to Bakewell in Derbyshire, near the boundary between his territories and the lands still under Viking control. There, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, he received the submission of multiple kings. Constantine II, King of the Scots, came and swore loyalty. Eldred, the Anglo-Saxon ruler of northern Northumbria, who had maintained independence in Bamberg while York remained Viking, acknowledged Edward's overlordship. The King of Strathclyde sent representatives. Even Ragnall, the Norse Viking king of York, came or sent envoys. What exactly these submissions meant is debated by historians. Did these northern kings genuinely accept Edward as their superior, or were they simply making diplomatic gestures to avoid conflict? Were they swearing absolute obedience, or just acknowledging Edward's power while maintaining their own autonomy? Probably something in between. Medieval concepts of overlordship were fluid and ambiguous. By swearing loyalty to Edward, these northern rulers gained his protection and avoided his enmity. But they would continue to rule their own territories, maintain their own armies, govern according to their own laws. Still, the symbolic importance was enormous. Edward had forced the most powerful leaders in Britain to acknowledge his supremacy. No Saxon king since the fall of Roman Britain had achieved such recognition. The chronicler who recorded this event clearly understood its significance. The entry for 920 lists all the kings who submitted, emphasizing that they recognized Edward as their lord, that they pledged to serve him faithfully. Edward had become, in effect, the first king of all Britain, not in the sense that he directly ruled all British territories, but in the sense that he was acknowledged as the supreme power, the overlord whom other kings accepted as their superior. This was Alfred's dream realized. Not just Wessex saved from Vikings, but all of Saxon England unified, expanded, transformed into a power that could dominate the entire island. And Edward had achieved it through 20 years of constant warfare, careful planning, strategic brilliance, and the partnership with his sister that had made everything possible. But the price had been high. Thousands had died in battles and raids. Families had been torn apart. Entire communities had been destroyed and rebuilt. Æthelflæd herself had been consumed by the effort, dying just as victory came within reach, and Edward was exhausted. By 924, Edward had been king for 25 years. He was around 50 years old, ancient by early medieval standards, when life expectancy was perhaps 35 or 40 for those who survived childhood. He had achieved everything his father had hoped for and more. England south of the Humber was unified under his rule. The Danish territories had been conquered and absorbed. The northern kingdoms acknowledged his overlordship. Wessex had been transformed from a desperate kingdom fighting for survival into the dominant power in Britain. But ruling an empire, even a small early medieval empire, required constant vigilance. There were always rebels, always ambitious nobles who thought they could carve out independence, always enemies probing for weakness. In the summer of 924, rebellion erupted on the Welsh border. A coalition of Cambro-Mercian rebels, Britons from Wales allied with discontented Mercians who still resented Edward's deposition of Ælfwine, rose up near Chester. Edward, despite his age, despite decades of campaigning, mustered an army one more time. He marched to Chester, confronted the rebels, defeated them. The details of this final campaign are frustratingly sparse. We don't know if there was a major battle or just a series of skirmishes. We don't know if Edward personally led the fighting or directed operations from behind the lines. What we know is that Edward completed his task. The rebellion was crushed. Order was restored. The Welsh border was secured. And then, at Farnham-on-Dee, just south of Chester, on July 17th, 924, Edward died. The circumstances of his death are unclear. Was he wounded in the fighting and died from his injuries? Did he fall ill from the exertion of campaigning at his age? Did he simply collapse from exhaustion, his body finally giving out after a lifetime of warfare and stress? The sources don't tell us. They record only the bald fact. Edward the Elder, king of the Anglo-Saxons, died at Farnham-on-Dee. His body was taken back to Winchester, to the new minster he had completed at the beginning of his reign. There he was buried beside his father Alfred and his mother Æthelflæd, in the royal mausoleum he had created. The kingdom mourned him, though perhaps not with the same intensity as it had mourned Alfred. Edward had never been called the Great during his lifetime, had never achieved the legendary status that Alfred acquired even before his death. Edward was respected, admired for his military success, recognized as an effective ruler, but he was not beloved the way Alfred had been, was not the stuff of legends. Perhaps this was because Edward's achievements were less dramatic than Alfred's. Alfred had saved Wessex from extinction, had held on when everything seemed lost, had transformed defeat into miraculous victory. Edward had taken the foundation Alfred built and expanded it, conquering territory, unifying kingdoms, transforming Wessex into England. Important work, essential work, but not the kind of desperate heroism that captures the imagination. Or perhaps it was simply that Edward's personality was less suited to legend-making. Alfred was scholarly, devout, a king who burned cakes and translated Latin texts and agonized over justice. Edward was a warrior administrator, a man who built fortresses and coordinated campaigns and managed the complex politics of a multi-kingdom realm. Competent, effective, but not colourful. Whatever the reason, Edward's death did not generate the outpouring of grief and commemorative writing that Alfred's had. The chroniclers noted his passing, listed his accomplishments, and moved on to record what happened next. What happened next was chaos. Edward had married 3 times and fathered at least 14 children. His succession should have been clear. His eldest son, Æthelstan, was around 30 years old, experienced in warfare and governance, raised specifically to be king. But complications that had been brewing for years now erupted. Æthelstan had been born to Edward's first wife Ælfwine, and her status was ambiguous. Was she truly Edward's wife, or had she been a concubine? If the latter, did that make Æthelstan illegitimate? And if Æthelstan was illegitimate, then the succession should go to Æthelwold, the eldest son of Edward's second wife Æthelflæd, who had unquestionably been Edward's queen. The Mercians immediately accepted Æthelstan as king. He had been raised in Mercia, was known to the Mercian nobles, was associated with Æthelflæd's legacy. The Mercians saw him as their king, someone who understood Mercian traditions and would respect Mercian autonomy. But Wessex hesitated. The West Saxon nobles, particularly those based in Winchester, preferred Æthelwold. He was indisputably legitimate, had been raised at Edward's court in Wessex, was thoroughly West Saxon in his outlook and loyalties. England seemed poised to split apart, to fracture into competing kingdoms ruled by half-brothers who each claimed their father's throne. And then, just 16 days after Edward's death, Æthelwold died. The circumstances are mysterious. Some sources suggest he died of illness. Others hint darkly at foul play, suggesting that Æthelstan's supporters murdered him. We will never know the truth. What we do know is that Æthelwold's death resolved the succession crisis. With the preferred West Saxon candidate dead, the nobles of Wessex had little choice but to accept Æthelstan. He was the eldest surviving son, he had Mercian support, and he had the military backing to enforce his claim if necessary. But acceptance was grudging, particularly in Winchester. The Bishop of Winchester did not attend Æthelstan's coronation in September 925 at Kingston upon Thames. He did not witness any of Æthelstan's charters for several years, a public snub that indicated his disapproval. Æthelstan faced rebellions and challenges throughout the early years of his reign. One of his half-brothers, Edwin, either fled England or was exiled, and later drowned in suspicious circumstances. The unity that Edward had built seemed fragile, ready to shatter at any moment. But gradually, Æthelstan consolidated his power. He proved himself a worthy successor to his father and grandfather, a brilliant military commander and capable administrator. He conquered York in 927, driving out the last Viking king. He defeated a massive coalition of Vikings, Scots and Britons at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937, the most famous Anglo-Saxon military victory of the entire era. By the time Æthelstan died in 939, England was truly unified, a single kingdom ruled by a single king. The work that Alfred had begun and Edward had continued was finally complete. Edward the Elder reigned for 25 years. In that quarter century, he fought dozens of battles and campaigns. He built hundreds of fortifications. He conquered territories covering thousands of square miles. He fathered 14 children, 3 of whom became kings of England. He transformed Wessex from a single kingdom into the core of a unified English nation. Yet today, few people have heard of him. Ask someone to name a famous Anglo-Saxon king, and they will likely say Alfred the Great. Maybe, if they're particularly well-educated or interested in history, they'll mention Æthelstan as the first true king of England. But Edward remains lost between his famous father and his even more famous son. Why is this? Part of the answer lies in the sources. We have far more documentation for Alfred's reign than for Edward's. Alfred himself wrote extensively, translated works from Latin into English, commissioned the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. His biography by Asser provides intimate details about his personality, his struggles, his achievements. He left a written legacy that made him accessible to later generations. Edward left almost nothing written. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle continues through his reign, but the entries are terser, more focused on bare facts than on personality or motivation. We have land charters, legal documents, administrative records, but these tell us what Edward did, not who he was or what he thought. Part of the answer lies in narrative structure. Alfred's story is dramatic. A desperate king hiding in marshes, his kingdom on the verge of extinction, achieving a miraculous victory against overwhelming odds. That's the stuff of legend, the kind of story that gets told and retold, embellished and remembered. Edward's story is less dramatic but perhaps more impressive. He inherited a stable kingdom and expanded it methodically, through careful planning and strategic brilliance, year after year, campaign after campaign. Important, essential work, but not the kind that captures the imagination in the same way. And part of the answer lies in the problem of sandwiching. Edward sits between two giants, Alfred the Great before him, Æthelstan the Glorious after him. Both his father and his son achieved victories that became legendary. Edward's achievements, substantial though they were, seem less remarkable by comparison. Medieval chroniclers recognise this problem. William of Malmesbury, writing in the 12th century, addressed it directly. He wrote that Edward was much inferior to his father in the cultivation of letters, but incomparably more glorious in the power of his rule. William understood that Edward's military achievements surpassed Alfred's, even if Edward lacked his father's scholarly reputation. Modern historians have begun to reassess Edward's importance. In 1999, a conference at the University of Manchester focused entirely on Edward's reign, the first such academic gathering dedicated to this often overlooked king. The papers presented there were published as a book in 2001, titled Edward the Elder, 8999-924. One of the contributors, Nick Hyam, wrote, Edward the Elder is perhaps the most neglected of English kings. He ruled an expanding realm for 25 years, and arguably did as much as any other individual to construct a single, south-centered Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Yet posthumously, his achievements have been all but forgotten. Another scholar, Simon Keynes, described Edward as far more than the bellicose bit between Alfred and Æthelstan. Keynes argued that Edward deserves recognition as one of the most important rulers in English history, a king whose strategic vision and military competence made everything that followed possible. Because that is Edward's true legacy. He made England possible. Alfred saved Wessex, yes, but Wessex was still just one kingdom among many, still surrounded by enemies, still vulnerable. Alfred's dream of a unified English nation remained just that, a dream. Æthelstan united England, yes, but he could only do so because his father had already conquered most of the territory, had already broken Viking power, had already created the administrative and military systems that made unified rule possible. Edward was the bridge. He took Alfred's desperate defensive struggle and transformed it into an offensive conquest. He took Wessex and turned it into England. Consider what England looked like when Edward became king in 899. Wessex controlled the southwest. Mercia controlled the West Midlands, but only through an alliance that could have fractured at any time. East Anglia, Essex, Eastern Mercia, all were Danish territories. Northumbria was entirely Viking. The Welsh kingdoms were independent. The Scots controlled the north. Now consider what England looked like when Edward died in 924. Wessex, Mercia, Essex, East Anglia, the East Midlands, all unified under Edward's rule. The Viking territories conquered and absorbed, the northern kingdoms acknowledging Edward's overlordship, the Welsh border secured. This transformation did not happen by accident or luck. It happened because Edward spent 25 years campaigning, building, planning, coordinating with his sister, defeating every enemy who challenged him. His partnership with Æthelflæd was particularly crucial. Medieval warfare was rarely coordinated across such distances with such precision. Edward operating in the south while Æthelflæd operated in the Midlands, their campaigns timed to support each other, their fortifications positioned to create an interconnected defensive network. This required constant communication, mutual trust, shared strategic vision. Æthelflæd's death in 918 must have been devastating for Edward, not just personally but strategically. He lost his most capable ally, the one person he could completely trust to execute their shared plans. Her death also created the political complications that led Edward to seize Mercia, deposing his niece, a ruthless act that tarnished his reputation among Mercians, but was probably necessary to preserve the unity he and Æthelflæd had built together. Edward's military innovations often go unrecognized. He perfected the Boer system that Alfred had pioneered, building fortifications at a scale and pace that the Vikings simply could not match. He coordinated armies across multiple theatres of operation. He used his fortresses not just defensively, but offensively, as bases for campaigns that could strike deep into enemy territory. His administrative reforms were equally important. Governing a multi-kingdom realm required new systems of communication, taxation, military organization. Edward couldn't just rely on traditional West Saxon methods. He had to create structures that could manage diverse populations, integrate Danish settlers who spoke different languages and followed different customs, coordinate with Mercian nobles who had their own traditions of governance. And he did it all while dealing with constant threats: rebellions, Viking raids, Welsh attacks, internal conspiracies. Edward's reign was never peaceful. He could never relax, never assume that victory was permanent. Every year brought new challenges that required military or diplomatic solutions. The toll on Edward himself must have been enormous. The sources give us almost no glimpse of his personal life, his thoughts, his emotions. But we can infer something from the bare facts. He outlived his first wife. He saw countless warriors die in his service. He lost his sister, his closest ally, and had to continue without her. He died on campaign, still fighting at an age when most people of his era were long dead. Medieval kingship was brutal. Kings were expected to lead from the front, to risk their lives in battle, to never show weakness or doubt. They had no privacy, no respite from the demands of rule. Every decision had life or death consequences. Every mistake could mean disaster for their people. Edward bore that burden for a quarter century, and he bore it successfully, achieving more than any reasonable person could have expected. His children carried on his work. Æthelstan completed the conquest of England. Edmund and Edred, Edward's sons by his third wife, ruled after Æthelstan, maintaining the unity their father and brother had created. Even his daughters contributed. Several married into European royal families, creating diplomatic connections that enhanced England's international standing. But it all began with Edward, the father who is forgotten, the king who sits in shadows, the man who built England while his father and son received the glory. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you will remember him. Remember the boy who grew up hiding from Vikings, who learned warfare and statecraft from the greatest King Wessex ever produced. Remember the young man who fought his first battle at 19, who defeated his cousin's rebellion, who survived when survival seemed impossible. Remember the king who partnered with his remarkable sister, who spent decades building fortresses and conquering territories, who transformed a desperate defensive struggle into triumphant expansion. Remember the strategist who understood that victory came not from single great battles, but from patient, methodical, coordinated campaigns. Remember the father whose children would rule England for generations, whose work made England itself possible, whose achievements laid the foundation for everything that followed. Remember Edward the Elder, the forgotten father of England, whose name should be spoken alongside his father Alfred and his son Æthelstan, as one of the three kings who created the English nation. His story ends where so many medieval stories end, with death on campaign, a funeral, a succession crisis. But his legacy endures. Every time we speak of England as a nation, rather than a collection of separate kingdoms, we are speaking of something Edward helped create. Every time we trace the history of English monarchy back through the centuries, we are tracing a line that runs through Edward's reign. he deserves to be remembered, not as Alfred's son or Æthelstan's father, but as Edward the Elder, king of the Anglo-Saxons, the man who conquered the Danelaw and unified southern England, the forgotten architect of a nation. So as you close your eyes and let sleep take you, carry with you one last image, a man in his 50s, tired from decades of warfare, standing at Farnham-on-Dee after yet another victory, looking out over the lands he had conquered and unified, knowing that he had accomplished what his father had only dreamed of, that he had built something lasting, something that would endure long after he was gone. And then, his work finally done, Edward rested, just as you rest now. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be gentle, and may you wake refreshed, perhaps remembering the forgotten father who shaped a nation.